Hyvää iltaa ja tervetuloa tähän Suomalaisuuden liiton järjestämään keskustelutilaisuuteen. Minä olen Onni Rostila ja vastaan tänään juontamisesta. Suomalaisuuden liitto on vuonna 1906 perustettu kansalaisjärjestö, jonka tehtävänä on herättää ja vahvistaa kansallista tietoutta ja ajattelutapaa sekä edistää suomalaista kulttuuria. Pitkälti yli 100 vuotta liitto on puolustanut suomenkielisten oikeuksia sekä vaalinut suomalaisten kansallista identiteettiä ja itsenäisyyttä. Tehtävämme suomalaisuuden puolustamisessa ei silti kenties koskaan ole ollut ajankohtaisempi. Tänä iltana olemme saaneet vieraaksemme kansainvälisesti tunnetun englantilaisen politiikan tutkijan ja kirjailijan Matt Goodwinin, joka kertoo meille viimeisimmästä kirjastaan Values, Voice and Virtue, The New British Politics. Kanssamme keskustelemassa on myös politiikan tutkija ja Turun yliopiston eduskuntatutkimuksen keskuksen johtaja, professori Markku Jokisipilä. Jokisipilä on kirjoittanut vuonna 2021 julkaistun kirjan Perussuomalaiset Halla-ahon ja Purran linjalla, jossa hän analysoi perussuomalaisten kannatuksen pohjavirtauksia. Hän on siis sivunut kotimaisessa kontekstissa niitä aihepiirejä, joiden käsittelystä Goodwin tunnetaan. Vieraamme Matt Goodwin toimi pitkään politiikan tutkimuksen professorina Kentin yliopistossa. Hänet tunnetaan tutkijana, politiikan kommentaattorina ja kirjoittajana. Hänen Roger Eatwellin kanssa kirjoittamansa kirja National Populism, The Revolt Against Liberal Democracy sekä hänen uusin teoksensa ovat molemmat olleet myyntimenestyksiä. Viimeisten vuosien aikana Goodwinista on tullut myös merkittävä blogisti ja mielipidevaikuttaja. Hänen Substack-blogillaan on tällä hetkellä reilusti yli 50 000 tilaajaa yli 160 maasta. Goodwin on myös usein nähty vieras Britannian televisiossa. Goodwin haastaa kirjoituksillaan vallitsevaa poliittista ajattelua ja haluaa auttaa ihmisiä vastaamaan niin sanotun uuden eliitin ajamaan poliittiseen ja kulttuuriseen vallankumoukseen, joka on vieraannuttanut suuren osan tavallisesta kansasta. Hänen kritiikistään saa osansa niin woke-vasemmistolaisuus kuin epäonnistunut ja eliittivetoinen maahanmuuttopolitiikka. Tämän tilaisuuden kieli on englanti, mutta tilaisuus nauhoitetaan ja tallenne tulee myöhemmin saataville suomenkielisellä tekstityksellä varustettuna. Seuraavaksi lausun alkusanat englanniksi. Good evening to all, once again. Welcome to this event organized by Suomalaisuuden liitto, a Finnish cultural organization founded in 1906 to defend the interests of the Finnish-speaking people, Finnish national identity and sovereignty. Tonight we are discussing a book called Values, Voice and Virtue, The New British Politics. We are honored to have the author himself, Dr. Matt Goodwin, joining us in this discussion. After his presentation, we will hear from our other guest, the director of the Center for Parliamentary Studies at the University of Turku, Professor Markku Jokisipilä. Lastly, we will have a panel discussion, and if there is time, we can take few questions from the audience. Dr. Goodwin is an academic, commentator, and best-selling author. He is particularly known for his research on populism, Brexit, public opinion, and academic freedom. Until recently, he was a long-time professor of politics at the University of Kent. Matt has written influential best-selling books, including National Populism, The Revolt Against Liberal Democracy with Roger Eatwell, as well as his most recent book, which will be discussed tonight. His Substack now has well over 50,000 subscribers from more than 160 countries. He is active on social media and is a frequent guest on British TV, offering his insights about national politics. As a critic of the so-called new elite, he defends those who feel their own politicians, journalists, and academics have left them behind. He has defended free speech in universities and wants to help us respond to the political and cultural revolution taking place in the West. He is committed to offering a new perspective and driving meaningful change in countering the excesses of identity politics and mass migration. This summer, he took actively part in the debate surrounding the Southport stabbing and the following riots. Our topics today will be centered around the themes of Dr. Goodwin's book, the new elite and its emergence, how they became so out of touch, the rise of national populist movements, and the future of Western democracies. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming our guest, Dr. Matt Goodwin.
Thank you for the very kind introduction, and thank you for joining the discussion this evening. As I was preparing for the talk, I was just reflecting on when I wrote the book and when it was published, which was last spring, 2023. At that time, we had a very strong Conservative government with an 80-seat majority. Boris Johnson had won the election in 2019, tapping into what we called at the time, and I did a lot of work on this, the political realignment of Western democracies. And what you were seeing was increasingly conservative movements like Donald Trump and others leaning into a new coalition of working class voters who often had not gone to university or maybe hadn't gone to an elite university, middle-aged and older voters, and culturally conservative voters. And in 2019, Boris Johnson really took that realignment to its natural conclusion by completely reshaping the Conservative Party electorate. And this book really was an attempt to explain how on earth that happened and how on earth conservatives were able to do that. Fast forward to today, and the political landscape in the UK has obviously completely changed. We now have what looks like, on paper, a very strong Labour government with the largest majority since 1997. And we have a Conservative Party that at the election in July suffered its worst defeat in history. So how can you explain both of those events? The rise of the Conservatives with a new coalition and then the sudden collapse of the Conservatives only 5 years later. Now, I would argue the answer to that riddle is in this book, which is that in 2019, the Conservatives tapped into millions of voters who, for reasons that I'll come on to, do not feel that their cultural values, their voice, and their sense of virtue, their identity, are represented and respected, not just in politics, but across a lot of institutions in society. And what then followed at the election 2 months ago was a rejection, a profound rejection of the Conservative Party by many of the same voters who either stayed at home by not voting at all, or they switched to Nigel Farage and the Reform Party, or what we might call a national populist or a national conservative alternative, whatever your preferred terms. But at the heart of this transition are the three new drivers of politics that I talk about in the book. What we have in the UK, which was partly reflected in the disturbances over the summer, which I associated very publicly and very clearly with the policy of mass immigration, and I can come back and talk about why I think that. But what we have in the UK is an elite consensus that represents no more than 20% of the country. That consensus is defined by large-scale migration, much of it low-skill, low-wage migration from outside of Europe. It's defined by hyper-globalization, the continuing prioritization of global corporations over the national economic interest. It's prioritizing the advance of highly socially liberal, if not radically progressive values, that from everything relating to gender identity to how we think about our history, increasingly, as Roger Scruton once called it, how we repudiate our national history and our culture. These positions, if you look at every major academic survey that we have in Britain, the British Social Attitude Survey, for example, these positions at best represent no more than 20% of British people. And those people tend to be university graduates who have passed through elite universities. Their parents tend to be graduates. They tend to live in the big cities, university towns. And I'm arguing in this book, they are losing touch with many of the people who live around them in the country. And what we've seen over the last 15 years, especially not just in the UK, but across the West, has been the greatest radicalization of the elite class since the 1960s. That is what I think we're living through today, is the greatest radicalization of the elite class since the 1960s. I'm often criticized in the UK because people say, well, Matt, your views have changed. My response to that, like my friend Andrew Sullivan in the US, you might know Andrew, he's a very interesting, moderate, conservative writer. He makes a very similar point. He says, you keep asking me, why have I changed? And my answer is, when did you change? Because when you look at the elite class in media, in politics, in culture, in creative industries, and a lot of evidence shows this, people like Matthew Iglesias in the United States, people like Zach Goldberg have shown many of the people who dominate the institutions have moved so far to the cultural left over the last 20 years that they've drifted away from the average voter. And that voter has been left with a palpable sense that their values, for example, wanting to lower migration, wanting to have strong national borders, being open to change, but wanting to slow the pace of change so the national culture, history, and way of life can be preserved and promoted, accepting that history is nuanced, but on balance, they think their country got more right than wrong in the past. Believing that how we define a community has to be about so much more than just celebrating diversity. Because if the only thing that defines you is that you celebrate diversity and multiculturalism, it's also like saying you have no identity of your own. And many people feel that they have a very palpable and defined sense of who they are. And the average voter on a lot of these questions, including economic questions as well, believing that big business is exploiting the working class, believing that global corporations are not interested in respecting the boundaries of the national community, believing that we need to do more to level the playing field between those at the top and those at the bottom. The average voter has been left behind, not just by left-wing politicians, but by conservative politicians too. And one of the arguments that I make in the book is, if you really want to understand the West, you have to what's happening politically in the West, you have to understand that the new elite class is not just on the left or the right. The new governing class covers much of the center-right and the center-left. It is essentially a stronger version of what academics before me, like Christopher Lasch, John Burnham, Daniel Bell, called the rise of the new adversity class. They principally derive their sense of status and their esteem and their honor by promoting their values to win applause from other members of the elite class, while also denigrating or openly criticizing their own national community to win more status from members of that elite class. And often advocating policies that bring them very few costs, but which bring enormous costs to everybody else. Mass immigration is the obvious example of that. Most of my academic colleagues in the universities, when we debated immigration, would be thinking about their PhD students from Sciences Po, or they'd be thinking about their international students from elite universities in Asia. They won't be thinking about the historically unprecedented levels of low-skill, low-wage migration that has displaced the working class over the last 20 years. And so on this question of cultural values, which have become much more important to people in the West, or as important as economic values, what I'm arguing in this book is that the elite class, broadly defined, have fundamentally lost touch with a large majority of voters on these cultural issues. That might be manageable were it not also for the fact that in almost every important and influential institution, it is the voice of the elite class that is magnified at the expense of everybody else. And in Britain, if you look at not just the House of Commons, but if you look at the mainstream media, if you look at the creative industries, the cultural institutions, the universities, if you look at the class that essentially defines how we talk about who we are, the knowledge class, that too has moved sharply to the left and has narrowed over time. So one example would be the media. In the 1970s and the 80s in Britain, you could make it into national media if you came from a relatively normal background. You could do an internship in London. You didn't need to have a university degree. You could essentially climb into national media from a normal background. That is now completely impossible. The media class has become very, very tightly dominated and controlled by elite graduates who typically come from very privileged families because they're the only ones who can afford to live in London. And people from more diverse backgrounds now struggle to break into legacy media. So the BBC is a great example of a legacy institution that talks endlessly about diversity in terms of race, sex, and gender, but never talks about diversity in terms of social class, educational background, or political ideology, because there is no diversity within legacy media. And as a consequence, when many voters are feeling as though their values are not respected, they're also looking at the institutions and asking themselves, well, where are people like me? Where are people who hold a voice or speak like me within these institutions? And they're not there. So if you are Nigel Farage, or you're a populist, or you're looking from the outside at the institutions and saying, well, you know, they no longer speak for the forgotten majority, I would argue the data certainly supports that. We have a creative class, largely overseeing galleries and museums, which I would argue has fully embraced critical race theory, which is now essentially defining British history through the prism of institutional racism and slavery, which is also visible in our schools and our universities, through the decolonization agenda, through the embrace of whether you call it cultural socialism, radical progressivism, but it is at its root, it is primarily anti-Western, unscientific, and openly political. And that ideology has pretty much taken control of most public sector institutions within the UK. We had a recent review of what was happening in our healthcare system, a government review, an independent review by a doctor called Hilary Cass, called the Cass Review. And she looked at the extent to which radical gender ideology had taken over the National Health Service. This was an independent review, not political. And her conclusion was that the supposedly impartial National Health Service and gender clinics were pushing children down medical pathways into gender transition without any sufficient evidence to be doing so. That the evidence for things like puberty blockers, for surgical procedures, was simply not there. It was nowhere near strong enough to be justifying the interventions that were happening. Now, this was a National Health Service. This is a National Health Service that is overseen by the expert class, but which Hilary Cass's review said is now basically dominated by political dogma, ideological dogma, at the expense of science and evidence. And that's one example, and I can talk endlessly about the museums and the schools and what's happening in other institutions, but it's an example of how the voice of an elite minority and an increasingly radical minority is being prioritized over the voice of others. And that explains, by the way, why so many people abandoned Boris Johnson. The joke in Westminster is that Boris Johnson was the third prime minister to be brought down by Boris Johnson. Having brought down David Cameron with the Brexit referendum, having brought down Theresa May with her soft Brexit deal, Boris Johnson then imploded himself by being completely unfit to be prime minister. But actually, behind the joke is a very serious point. Boris Johnson campaigned as the guy that would tap into the realignment around people's sense that their values weren't represented and they were no longer given a voice in the mainstream. He was very, very good at tapping into that. He promised them that they would get Brexit done. He promised them that they would take back control. And he promised areas outside of the big cities, that they would be leveled up, that he would do more for the working class districts. What Boris Johnson did instead was he completely liberalized the immigration system. We had no shift to a high skill, points-based immigration system. He just liberalized the whole system. And so we also had a conservative government that didn't really invest seriously in working class districts. It found it too complicated. And essentially, Boris Johnson lied to the country. I mean, he lied to conservative voters. That's certainly something I've argued publicly. And those voters, understandably, felt very betrayed and felt as though within the context of the Conservative Parliamentary Party and much of the political class, somebody who had claimed to give them a voice had actually really betrayed those voters in a very big way. And I always laugh at people on the left in Britain who say, well, we've just had 14 years of a far-right government, which is what people on the left say in Britain because we've had 14 years of conservative rule. I laugh because we never had a more pro-immigration government as the one that Boris Johnson gave us. I mean, it was the most pro-immigration government you could have had pretty much in British history. We saw net migration rates go up to over 700,000 a year. He liberalized migration from outside of Europe, and he lost control of the borders, giving us the small boats crisis. And so by the time you got to the election last year, you had millions of people feeling as though, once again, their values weren't represented by the political class. They didn't have a voice in the conversation. And the acceleration of what we might call radical progressivism or cultural socialism or woke ideology, everybody has a different term. I don't think the word woke is particularly helpful at the moment. I prefer radical progressivism. The acceleration of that ideology is also now leaving people with a sense that simply because they happen to belong to the wrong identity group, straight, white, male, conservative, they are no longer treated with the same degree of respect. They no longer have the same amount of social status, and they're no longer considered to be as virtuous as other groups in society. And what I think we're seeing is really the imposition of an ideology within British politics, which we might call asymmetrical multiculturalism. The idea that essentially racial, sexual, gender minorities are now considered to be by much of the elite classes to be morally superior, to be more interesting as a priority, while members of the wider majority are considered to be problematic, suspicious, morally inferior, if not openly racist and ignorant. And I'll end just by saying that there are lots of examples of how this ideology has taken hold of British politics, from private schools in England that actually separate children into different racial groups, and they ask the white children to apologize for their whiteness, which is which is opposite to what civil rights campaigners wanted in the 1950s and the 1960s. They wanted colorblind anti-racism. They didn't want this aggressive form of anti-racism. But where we are now as a society, which is what we saw during the riots and the protests, is an elite class that I would argue is no longer even capable of actually talking about the grievances that voters hold. The reason the Conservative Party was rejected fundamentally was because it lost control of immigration and it lied to voters. The Labour Party didn't win the election because there was a mass upswing of public enthusiasm. Already, 2 days ago, Keir Starmer's ratings are -30. He's very unpopular. The Labour government is very unpopular. It's just that people felt betrayed by the Conservatives. But what was most interesting in the aftermath of that election victory was watching Keir Starmer and the Labour Party respond to the riots and the protests in the UK. Because what you saw in that moment was, yes, there was criminality and there was violence, and people who engaged in criminality and violence should have been sent to prison. But when people were asked by pollsters why they protested and why they thought people were protesting in the UK, 66% of all voters said it was because of recent immigration policy, that they felt they're no longer in control of their own country and they no longer feel safe in their own country. And this isn't just a problem for the Labour Party, this is a problem for the entire elite class in our country, which again has lost touch with the values of ordinary voters and is no longer keeping them in the conversation or even really interested in talking to them about why they feel so alienated and frustrated by these issues like migration and the collapse of our borders. And so if you're in Finland looking at the UK from the outside, just in the last minute, the lessons from the realignment in Britain would be this. If you're on the conservative side of the political spectrum and you mobilize voters around that realignment, you'd better actually give them policies that reflect their values. Because if you don't, they'll leave, which is exactly what happened to the Conservative Party. They treated those voters like idiots, basically, and then promised them everything and then gave them the opposite. The second thing that I think needs to be taken from the British experience is politics is not enough. We also need to reform the institutions, broadly defined, so people feel as though they're in the national conversation. Media, culture, creative industries, publishing, museums, galleries, because across the spectrum, if you are working class, if you are non-graduate, if you haven't gone to university, if you're culturally conservative, in many Western democracies, you're not in the conversation, essentially. And the third thing that I think needs to be taken away from the UK experience is the need for a very concerted, strong pushback to radical progressive ideology within the institutions. In the universities, we've campaigned very hard for free speech and free expression and academic freedom. I helped to design a law. It was the first law in the West that promotes free speech in the universities. And that was passed by the Conservative government. And 2 weeks ago, the new Labour government has said it's going to repeal that law because it no longer believes that it's necessary to defend free speech in the universities. So the battle is still very much underway, something that I write about almost daily now in the Substack. But the battle is underway. But those are the three big lessons that I think come out of the UK experience. Donald Trump is probably, I suspect, going to win in November. And even if he doesn't, he's still staying very tightly rooted in the political realignment that's going on across the West. In fact, if anything, Donald Trump has extended it by reaching into Hispanic voters and African American voters. The British Conservatives have instead gone from winning that realignment in 2019 to offering the world a masterclass in how to lose that realignment in only 4 years. It's a remarkable political experiment and one that you would do well to learn from. So thank you for some comments to take us into conversation. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Goodwin. And now let's go ahead and please, Mr. Jokisipilä, you can go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, Professor Goodwin, for your extremely interesting presentation and especially for the fascinating book that you have written. And I still remember back in 2018 when the book National Populism, The Revolt Against Liberal Democracy was published, and I was reading that and it was a big inspiration for me because at the same time I was preparing my book of the Finns Party, Perussuomalaiset Party in Finland, and I was astonished when I found out how much common ground there was between the phenomenon that you were describing in your book and what I was witnessing what was happening in Finland. The Finns Party back in 2011 brought a systemic change in Finnish politics because the reality from the beginning of 1980s had been that the big three parties, the Conservative National Coalition and then Social Democrats and the Centre Party, they used to get to from 65 to 67% of all votes in parliamentary elections. So then forming a government was easy business after that. The biggest party took the prime ministerial seat and then it made the other two compete against each other and then it took took that one to the government, which promised more to similar kind of policies that it was about to commit or do as a prime ministerial party. But this pattern was shattered then in 2011 when the Finnish party grew from 6 candidates in the parliament to 39 candidates. And we are still, in a way, in a shock, I would say, a bit. The Finnish political system is in a shock. And still, the political competitors, the media, the academic researchers are trying to find ways of coping with this new reality that was created already 13 years ago. I was browsing through discussions about your new book. I saw that you have been criticized of becoming the part of the populist movement that you are trying to analyze and trying to explain. And I have to say that this makes me very empathetic because this is a very familiar phenomenon to me as well. I remember back in 2021 I was accused of very similar kind of things. Well, I personally have been witnessing the rise of national populism, especially from 2 standpoints or 2 points of view. As a follower of Finnish politics and as a researcher, I see that growing number of voters feel that the established political elites, especially in these former big 3 parties, parties both on the left and right, have failed to come up with credible solutions or credible political strategies to cope with the challenges that ordinary citizens are facing in their everyday lives. I would say more and more this has to do with immigration, even in Finland, although the numbers are considerably smaller than what is happening in Great Britain, for example. Then I have been witnessing this phenomenon as an academic researcher, and I have seen that there is this reluctance on the part of majority of academic researchers to acknowledge the real reasons behind the rise of national and conservative movements. There's a lot of talk about racism and xenophobia, but then less talk about economy and these more traditional political reasons behind the election results. And I say that it's not a coincidence that now in four parliamentary elections in a row, the Finnish party has been biggest among the working class voters, which is a historical failure on the part of, for example, the Finnish Social Democratic Party, which used to be clearly number one in this group of voters for decades. Well, one of the main theses in your new book, like you mentioned, is that the liberal elites have lost touch with the everyday realities and ways of thinking of the so-called silent majority. And I very much feel that the similar kind of thing is happening and has been happening in Finland as well. And I very much feel also that besides the politicians, this liberal elite consists also of mainstream media and the academic world. And I remember one of the main theses in my book back in the day was that Finnish media and political scientists have been unable to take a neutral stance towards the Finnish party and have partly become political activists themselves, trying to tell their audiences how dangerous and bad this new party is and how its growing popularity is a threat to our liberties and a threat to our democratic system. Well, having said this or published this, I was met with fierce criticism and from some of the journalists and some of the academic researchers and some of my academic colleagues wrote very poisonous reviews of the book and questioned my credibility as an academic researcher. However, I'm still here, so they were less than successful in this respect. And I see that you have now been subjected to similar criticism, and like I said, this makes me very empathetic. Yeah, this new book, the main statement there is hugely fascinating. You said that the new ruling elite is pro-European Union, pro-globalization, sees mass immigration as a positive and only as a positive thing and necessary, and speaks for liberal values. Then on the other side of the fence, we have those people who hold more traditional views, who underline the importance of national sovereignty, traditional conservative values, and controlling and limiting immigration in possible ways. Well, in your 2018 book, together with Roger Eatswell, you very convincingly stated that there is this new divide between liberal cosmopolitan values and national conservatism. And you stated then 6 years ago that this will be the new dominant reality of European politics. And I think this is where this has very much happened already. And your new book is a logical continuation. And the events that you depict there are logical continuation of where we were in 2011. Well, I personally still, some 10 years ago, I thought that some kind of reconciliation would happen. That would have been a very Finnish kind of solution, because we are traditionally a consensus-seeking political culture between these, which were two very different political views. but I see that this has not happened. And I remember still in 2011 when political scientists and journalists, political journalists were making predictions that the popularity of Finns party will fade away at the latest when they take a seat in the government. Well, now they are in the government for the second time already, and they are bigger than ever, 46 MP, 45, because there was this one which left the group, but they are bigger than ever, and they are holding major governmental seats and using real political power. But even then, time has passed and 13 years has gone by since the first big election result. I would say that the Finns party, compared to the older traditional parties, they are still an odd bunch of politicians. They are different in very many ways. And they talk differently, they act differently, and still the mainstream media and us, the academic researchers, we have difficulties in thinking about what kind of attitude we should take towards the party. And I would say that at least part of the media and parts of the academia, they are still on this crusade against national populists, the Finns party in Finland, but more generally all similar kind of parties all over Europe. And Trump, of course, is very much a topic here in this discussion as well. And at the same time, which I think what has happened after 2018, your first book, and even after 2021, my book, is that we have entered this new kind of reality of intensified information war. Both sides of the struggle, if you want to call it that, are battling for the monopoly of truth and are accusing the other side of lying and of spreading all kinds of different conspiracy theories. You only have to go to X, the former Twitter, and you see that this is taking place as we speak all the time. And in 2021, in my book, I recommended that the liberal elite in the media and in the academia should try to overcome this contempt and distaste that they have for the national populist political alternative and treat, for example, the Finns party exactly the same way as they are treating other political parties. But I think that this is still not the case. And I said that still 10 years ago I was optimistic that some kind of reconciliation would take place. Now, 10 years later, I have to say that I think that the situation has only become worse. The liberal elites in our societies, in my opinion, they are even more reluctant to discuss the economic, social and political reasons behind the rise of national conservative populist movements. Instead, they keep on talking about racism, misogyny, Islamophobia, ultra-conservatism, extremism, threat to democracy, other such things. You name it, you certainly can recognize the discussion. And I think that Finns party serves as a perfect example of this development. Many journalists and academians are branding the party, even if it's a governmental party now, as an extreme right movement, and are seeing that the fact that the Finns party now is in the government is a threat to Finnish democracy and Finnish rule of law. And some are having even more radical views, are saying that the final goal of the Finns party is to exact some kind of revolution in Finland and then come up with this new authoritarian form of government. Many highly redeemed liberal journalists and researchers are saying, have been saying that now the Finns party being in government means that we are on the same road as Hungary, gradually moving away from democracy and eventually abandoning it altogether in favor of authoritarian forms of government. Well, in my opinion, these views are almost ridiculously exaggerated and completely detached from the realities of Finnish political culture and our multi-party coalition governments. You only have to know a little bit something about Finnish political history to understand how wild this accusation is that we would have a governmental party. We would have a party that over 600,000 Finnish voters would have given their support to, which would have as a goal to exact some kind of political revolution. Well, back in 2011, I saw the rise of Finnish party as a welcome thing for the point of view of Finnish voters because it increased the scope of political alternative and was a completely, I think, understandable and expected backlash to the unwillingness of our traditional three big parties to address certain political issues, such as immigration, but also, for example, the negative aspects of the Finnish membership in the European Union. And traditionally, Finnish political culture has been very, very skillful in absorbing challenges both from the left and right. And for example, during the Cold War years, we had a very strong communist party, one of the strongest communist parties in whole Europe, and they were tamed. by the Finnish political culture and other parties. Well, in today's realities, unfortunately, I see no sign of this happening. Before the parliamentary elections 2023, the last parliamentary elections that we have, on the contrary, the Social Democrats, the Left Alliance and the Greens announced publicly that they won't participate in the same government as the Finns party. And this is a radical breakthrough from the traditional Finnish political culture, where usually for many decades the thing has been that it has been possible for any two parties in the parliament to cooperate together in the government. Now we have lost this, it's no longer valid. And I would say that the current political realities in Finland are marked by growing polarization and unwillingness of the Green left parties to accept the legitimacy of the National Conservative political alternative. And as a reaction to this, the Finns party, in my opinion, has become gradually more and more militant in its criticism of the Green left parties, realizing and accepting the fact that the only possibility for them to be in the government is as a part of coalition of all forces, all four parties on the right, which is currently the situation. Common government between the Finns party and the Social Democratic Party. I don't see any signs of that happening in the coming 10 years or even 20 years. And the sad thing about this is that the flexibility of coalition formation has been traditionally one of the strengths of Finnish political systems. And now it seems that we have lost that. And it's a big thing happen. It's a very big change. And it seems that it has become more and more difficult to have a rational, sensible discussion about those things that are politically most decisive. Immigration, of course, then, for example, climate policies is another example of this. And then this liberal conservative values, those are very disappointing, and you tend to get pessimistic when you are looking at, for example, Twitter discussions between Finnish MPs from different parties on these topics. And I would say that in today's political realities, there are very heavy pressures of choosing your side. If you so much as hint to the possibility of failure of immigration policies having something to do with it, you are automatically branded as being far-right, racist, Putin's useful idiot, you name it. And on the other side of the fence, on the National Conservative side, you are accused of being a liberal softie, even a hippie. I see that this is a common accusation as well, and being a victim of Green left conspiracy theories. So there is not much move for sensible, rational political debate anymore, and that is a sad thing, because I have to say, as a researcher with a genuine willingness to understand what is going on in the world and in our country, and what are the underlying reasons behind people's actions, for example, to vote for certain parties, I find this new political terrain rather depressing and very, very, very hard to navigate. I promised to say something in Finnish language. Do I still have time for that? Absolutely. It takes maybe 1 minute. So I think that luulen, että suurin osa ymmärsitte, mitä mä englanniksi sanoin. En lähde kääntämään uudestaan, mutta totean vaan, että muistan, kun perussuomalaiset kasvoivat 6 kansanedustajasta 39 kansanedustajan 2011, niin en salaa yhtään sitä, että olin tyytyväinen tästä ja katsoin, että niin kuin meidän valtapuolueet, sosiaalidemokraatit, keskusta, kokoomus olivat laiskistuneet sen takia, että heille se hallituspaikka tuli ikään kuin automaattisesti niin kuin lähes joka eduskuntavaalien jälkeen ja pahimmassakin tapauksessa niin, että 4 vuotta oltiin oppositiossa. Ja näiden 3 puolueen politiikka oli alkanut muistuttamaan toinen toisiaan yhä enemmän. Niin se oli terve korjausliike mielestäni, mitä tapahtui 2011. No sitten ajattelin poliittisen historian tutkijana silloin, että tapahtuisi jotain samanlaista perussuomalaisten suhteen kuin mitä tapahtui aikanaan, tai on tapahtunut aikanaan 1920-30-luvulla sosiaalidemokraattisen puolueen suhteen, sitten mitä tapahtui SKDL:n suhteen, mitä tapahtui SNP:n suhteen. Että niistä hioutuu särmiä sen verran, ne kesyyntyvät sen verran, että niistä tulee tämmöinen uskottava ja muiden puolueiden hyväksymä koalitiokumppani. No perussuomalaiset on tällä hetkellä hallituksessa, mutta sanoisin, että esimerkiksi se vaihtoehto, että sosiaalidemokraattinen puolue ja perussuomalaiset voisivat olla samassa hallituksessa, niin sen suhteen ollaan kauempana, missä oltiin vaikkapa 2011-2015. Ja se on äärimmäisen mielenkiintoinen ja huomionarvoinen seikka, että nyt 4 eduskuntavaalit peräkkäin, niin työväenluokkaistaustaisissa äänestäjissä perussuomalaiset on ollut ylivoimaisesti suosituin vaihtoehto. Ja sen kuvittelisi olevan niin kuin huolestuttava asia sosiaalidemokraattisen puolueen piirissä tai vasemmistoliiton piirissä. Mutta sanon, että tätä muutosta, mitä Matthew Goodwin omassa esityksessään kuvasi Britannian näkökulmasta, niin mielestäni Suomessa samanlainen, tietysti koska nämä on globaaleja trendejä nykyään, niin kuvastaa aika hyvin se, jos tarkastelee, että mitä on 1980-luvulta tähän päivään mennessä tapahtunut SKDL:n, sitten sen seuraajien ja vasemmistoliiton eduskuntaryhmän koostumuksella. Kuinka monta perinteistä työväenluokkaisen ammatin edustajaa löydätte nykyisestä vasemmistoliiton eduskuntaryhmästä. Ja tämä ei ole normatiivinen kannanotto millään tavalla niin kuin minkään ammatin puolesta tai mitään vastaan. Totean vaan, että nämä puolueet, jotka niin kuin ovat perinteisesti edustaneet työväenluokkaa, niin jo tarkastelemalla niiden eduskuntaryhmän kokoonpanoa niin huomaa se, että tällaisia niin kuin todella isoja mannerlaattojen siirtymiä on tapahtunut siellä, että mitä nämä puolueet edustavat ja ketkä näitä puolueita äänestävät. Jää nähtäväksi, mihin tästä päädytään. Muistan silloin 2011, kun toimittajat minulta kysyivät, että tuleeko nyt käymään niin, että kun perussuomalaiset kasvoi isoksi, niin nyt nähdään sitten eduskunnassa, että nämä on tämmöinen populistinen pölhöjen porukka, mitkä eivät saa mitään aikaiseksi ja sitten se kutistuu. No 2015 ei kutistunut, päinvastoin puolue meni hallitukseen. No silloin kysyttiin, että tuleeko tapahtumaan se, mitä populistipuolue yleensä tapahtuu, että sitten se hallitusvastuu syö suosion pois. No siinä tuli sitten vähän tämmöinen erikoisempi kuvio, että eduskuntaryhmä hajosi kahtia ja soinilaiset lähtivät sinne omaan suuntaansa ja sitten Halla-ahon johdolla puolue onnistui voittamaan entistä maahanmuuttokriittisempänä versiona 2019 kaikki ne menettämänsä paikat takaisin ja yksikään näistä eduskuntaryhmän loikkareista ei tullut valituksi. Sitten 2023 puolue kasvoi suurimmaksi koskaan, 46 kansanedustajia, yli 600 000 ääntä. Niin olen politiikan tutkija kollegoille ja toimittajalle sanonut, että kyllä pikkuhiljaa nyt sitten niin kun 13 vuoden jälkeen kannattaa niin kun ruveta totuttelemaan niin kun sen vaihtoehdon kanssa, että kyllä tämä perussuomalaiset on tainnut tulla jäädäkseen. Ja on hyvä ottaa huomioon, että 3 eduskuntavaalit peräkkäin puolue on ollut toiseksi suuri puolue eduskunnassa jo. Se ainoa iso saavutus, mikä vielä puuttuu, on se suurimman puolueen paikka ja sekin on ihan mahdollista. Niin pikkuhiljaa toivoisin, että päästäisiin siitä niin kuin ehkä jossain määrin tällaisesta, ei nyt hysteerisestä, mutta moralistisesta kauhistelusta siitä, että tällainen puolue saattaa saada niin paljon ääniä, niin aitoa pohditaan siitä, että mistä tämä johtuu, mitkä ne syyt on, jotka puolueelle tuo kannatusta. Näin, kiitoksia.
Thank you very much to both of you gentlemen, Matt for the great presentation and the valuable Finnish perspective from Markku. Although I must say that Markku, your Finnish language part slightly went more than 1 minute, but because of the Suomalaisuuden liitto's agenda, it was more than okay. I would like to begin the panel discussion part now by asking something that I promised to mention in my introduction, which is about democracy in the era of rapid ethnic change. Matt, you discussed in your presentation this kind of feeling of betrayal in the voters because of this process going on and on despite repeatedly voting against it. So I would like to ask both of you that how do you see the challenges in democratic system when the voting population is in rapid turmoil, so to speak?
I think it's a great question. At broad level, I think what we're seeing are 2 different conceptions of democracy going against one another. I think we have a sort of traditional liberal conception of democracy that many members of the elite like to think that they're advocating. And then we have a more direct conception of democracy where people are trying to rally around and push forward the majority will on issues on which they feel the elite have come unstuck. And I think that battle is playing out in most, if not all, Western democracies in different forms. And I think where immigration comes in, as Robert Putnam first pointed to, I think, around 2011, 2012, immigration and ethnic change come in because when you subject national communities to the level of change that is now happening in places like the UK, which, to give you some insight, we've had 4 million people come in to the UK over the last 3 years. We're experiencing population growth of 10%, which we've never experienced in our history. 1 in every 27 people in the UK entered the country in the last 4 years. and we have a higher foreign-born population than America at the time of Ellis Island, which gives you some sense of what we're experiencing. Robert Putnam's argument was when you have that pace of change, you have a low social trust and falling support for welfare. So, it can have a very tangible impact on support for the regime, if you like. And I just wanted to add, because I really enjoyed the second talk, because it pressed so many buttons in my personal experience. One of the challenges around that is actually not so much immigration and ethnic change, but is actually the reaction of the elite to that change. And one of the interesting points you made was about reconciliation. Why has there not been reconciliation? And I've also been thinking about this in recent years. Why is it that, for lack of a better word, the liberal elite are not interested in responding to voters on these issues? And I've gone round and round in my head. I've looked at Jonathan Haidt's work on the righteous mind and how liberals struggle to relate to things like group loyalty and community. And I've looked at Thomas Sowell's arguments about conservatives seeing liberals as misguided and liberals seeing conservatives as evil, and the sort of conflict of visions that we have. But I've just finished reading a book by a psychologist called Luke Conway, and the book is called Liberal Bullies. And he's a professor of psychology, very esteemed. And he says, one of the remarkable things about psychology and the literature on psychology, and you alluded to this, is they spent 70 years looking at right-wing authoritarianism, but never looking at left-wing authoritarianism. And he said the only guy who looked at it was Bob Altmaier, who concluded that if you look at authoritarianism as being support for a revolution, there is no left-wing authoritarianism. But what Luke Conway does in this excellent book is he says, well, if you just reframe the scale and you don't ask people about revolutionary change, but you ask them, would you willingly clamp down on people if they violate your sacred values, your new religion, your ideology? And what he finds is then liberals are off the scale. They're more dogmatic than conservatives. And you see this in other evidence. They're more likely to unfriend people on social media. They're more likely to block people on social media. And I think a microcosm of this is the literature on populism, because, I can probably go further than you in that I've willingly, happily left the university behind me. But I'll be really honest, the literature on populism is a highly politicized literature, which is, in my time, being in that literature for 15 years, was almost exclusively supported by left-wing political parties and foundations. Party conferences, workshops. It was entirely acceptable for academics to demonstrate political loyalty to center-left and green parties. But if you voiced any sympathy for conservative positions, you were seen as a heretic. Now, I can say this with that my life behind me. And I think this is an insight into one of the big problems that we have. It isn't just competing visions of democracy. It is that one side of this debate do not want to compromise on any of these issues which they see as being sacred values. Pro-immigration, pro-globalization, gender ideology, anti-Western, CRT. These are sacred values for a radicalized minority of the elite class. And they're not going to compromise on these issues. And I have been screaming into the wilderness saying, you're going to have to compromise with voters. You're going to have to slow down the pace of change. You're going to have strong borders. You're going to have to stop teaching kids that boys can become girls and girls can become boys when the science isn't behind you, because mums and dads are going to rebel over that. But there is no willingness to compromise. And that is the biggest danger facing democracy, I think.
Marko.
Yes, just a couple of quick notions to add. We are, of course, not as far down the line as Great Britain is in terms of immigration. I think is it around 10% that we have now, the people with foreign background who are living in Finland. So we are still waiting how this will affect, for example, the election results. But I think that there's this funny thing that the parties on the left and the Green Party, they tend to think that all immigrants, when they come to Finland, move and start to live here, that they will become voters for the parties on the left or the Green Party. And when we are thinking about the directions where these people are coming from, there are a lot of people coming from the Middle Eastern countries. Then we have a lot of Russians and we have a lot of Estonians. And I would say that the majority of these people, they tend to think conservatively. So it remains to be seen, will they vote for the Social Democratic Party or the Left Alliance or the Green Party? Because I think that if they vote according to their heart, there are better choices for them. For example, if you are a Middle Eastern conservative man, then maybe Christian Democrats would be the best suited version of the political parties for you. So, but it remains to be seen in Finland. And I think I haven't done the calculation, but we have, I think, 5 immigrant background MPs now in the current eduskunta, the parliament. So this number, of course, tends to grow because we have all the parties, they have promising candidates who are moving up in the political ranks, and I think that there will be more immigrant background MPs after the next parliamentary elections. Then this one comment about the academic life and the relationship of academians towards the national conservatives. There is this funny notion that we have to do in this because the chairman is a member of parliament for the Finns party, and we have the people from Finns party in the audience. Even I think that the Finns party has to thank the Finnish academic life for at least 2 leaders of the party, because Jussi Halla-aho, before he became active in politics, he was a researcher in Helsinki University and did a doctoral dissertation. But then the professor hated his political agenda so much that there was this active push away from the university. The professor wanted to get rid of him. And then Mr. Halla-aho realized that he has no future in Finnish university life, so he decided to become a politician. Then Riikka Purra, the current leader of the party, she was actually studying in my university, and I might even have she might even have sat on one of my lectures in the first years of 2000s or so. But she was about to do a doctoral dissertation on immigration policies on European scale. But then she realized at some point that there is this idea that if you are researching immigration, you have to do it from the point of view that it's a positive thing. And this, you mentioned hyperglobalization, that you should welcome this phenomenon, and you should look at it from that kind of point of view, that okay, it's a welcome thing, and the more people we have moving in, the better. And she realized that okay, being critical in this atmosphere in the long run is an impossible situation. And then in 2016, she decided to become a politician and is now leader of the Finns party.
So there's something good about academic closed-mindedness after all.
I was just going to say briefly, it is possible to be a critic, but it will make your life miserable. You have to understand, they will do everything they can to isolate, alienate, attack, bully, harass. And ironically, while doing so and saying they are the most liberal people of all, it's a funny thing. As Thomas Sowell once said, the next time a professor tells you how wonderful diversity is, ask them how many conservatives are in their sociology department.
Actually, that fits quite well in the left-wing authoritarianism that you described earlier. But I want to ask specifically from Matt about UK's politics 2 questions. First, if you could recap one more time the Southport incidents and its following demonstrations and riots, because in Finland, the narrative that is widely in our mainstream media, kind of official narrative, so to speak, was that there was some type of disinformation in social media, mainly on X, and that what inflamed the whole situation. And then another question regarding the future of British realignment, so to speak. How do you see the Nigel Farage's Reform Party and its chances to capitalize on the realignment in the future?
Well, on the riots and the protests, the specific trigger. Remember, this was the worst rioting the UK has seen in certainly since the 1980s, if not in the post-war era. We had sporadic, spontaneous protests across the country, and for a while it looked like things were really going to get out of control. Officially, the trigger for the rioting and the protests was a young guy who ran into a Taylor Swift dance class for children, and he stabbed many of the children, killed 3, injured 8, and the thing at the time was that the attack, even though much of the media presented the riots and the protests that followed were a direct reaction to that attack, because there was an awkward window where nobody knew who had committed the stabbings, and there was a tweet that suggested it had been an asylum seeker, which later turned out to be inaccurate. It was the son of 2 migrants who had come over from Rwanda. But what the media missed, and I think much of the conversation missed, was that the stabbings took place alongside a number of other incidents. One was a pretty brutal attack on police officers at Manchester Airport by 2 young local British Muslim guys who very physically assaulted 2 police officers. Then there was the near murder of a British Army officer who was almost stabbed to death outside of his home by a guy from a minority Afro-Caribbean background. Then we had gangs fighting one another with machetes in a seaside town of Southend-on-Sea, which had also been going viral on social media. So in the context of that week, 10-day period, the Southport stabbings were really the sort of, the icing on the cake, if you like, of that sort of grievance, that frustration, or the kind of another trigger catalyst. And so I always felt, and clearly most other people in the country also felt, if you look at the polling, that actually what this was really about was not a tweet. The media kind of smothered itself in a comfort blanket and said, this is about misinformation. We can solve all of this if we get rid of Elon Musk, basically, was the narrative. Let's just shut down social media. And people were calling for social media to be shut down and for television channels to be closed. But for a large number of people in the country, myself included, this was partly about a radical minority of hooligans who should have been arrested and put in prison, and they were. But actually, this was about a much larger number of people no longer feeling safe in their country, no longer feeling that immigration was under control, and no longer feeling that the borders were secure. And we have had a number of high-profile cases over the last year of people who are not from Britain attacking, murdering, raping, and abusing British citizens in their own country, and nobody in the political class being able to offer a credible solution to what is going on. And it is the same story in Germany at the moment, where people are now saying, we are sick of the excuses and the comfort blankets. We want a serious response to these challenges. And that's why I stuck my neck out and I wrote a Substack the 2 days after the rioting had started and said what I thought was going on. And, clearly I was the only person in the country who said that, really. And a lot of people responded to it because, as we then learned a few days later in the opinion polls, 67% of people, when they said, who do you blame for these riots and protests? 67% said, I blame recent immigration policy. They certainly blame the rioters as well, but they could see that this was about a country that no longer felt safe and no longer felt secure. And unfortunately, the Labour government took a very hardline view, an authoritarian view of saying, instead of responding, there was an asymmetry. So I realize I'm talking, so I'll keep this brief. There was an asymmetry in that we had riots in 2011, under a conservative government. And at that time, everybody on the left said, as they always say, riots are the voice of the unheard. And in that time, the rioting was about austerity, and the rioting was about public spending cuts. And we had this prolonged debate for weeks about how bad the Conservatives were, and there were legitimate grievances behind the disturbances. The Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, Keir Starmer took the knee, and he said there are legitimate grievances as to why police officers are being assaulted on the streets of the UK. He took the knee after 30 police officers had been assaulted by Black Lives Matter protests. But we were allowed to have a conversation about what the root cause was behind BLM. This time, it was very interesting. The same Keir Starmer said, there is no debate to be had here. This is far-right thuggery. This is all about the white British majority. This is not about anything else. We're shutting this down. And by the way, we're introducing new free speech limits. So they've introduced something called legal but harmful speech and non-crime hate incidents. So what that means is if I come to your house tonight and you say something to me offensive, what I consider to be offensive, I can call the police and say, my Finnish friend just said something offensive to me in his house, and the police will write that up as a non-crime hate incident, and it will be on your criminal record. So this is where we are at. Not to mention Labour politicians saying we should shut down, like Brazil, we should just shut down social media so people can't even talk about these issues. Now, for the sake of time, I'm just going to leave your second question because the answer is in the book. But let me just say one quick thing. I am deeply, deeply concerned about the direction of the UK because of those issues, because the rioting and the protests that we saw in the summer, this is not the end. This is simply an expression of a very deep reservoir of disillusionment in the country. And until we can control the borders, I've got a documentary coming out next week on Substack, which is where I suggest what we need to do to actually control the borders. It's not irresponsible. It's countercultural. I simply say, these are the laws that we need to change. These are the conventions we need to leave. And the reason I'm going so hard on that is because I think unless people can start to feel secure in their own country, they will be backlashing, however incoherently and inarticulately, they will be backlashing against authorities because they feel they don't have control over their own country. So that was my interpretation of the event. So my critics, if they were here, would say, well, this was just about violent criminals and thugs who we then sent into prison. And the irony of that is just to get these people into prison, okay, and as I was explaining with Jussi, we were talking earlier on, just to get some of these people in prison over the last month, including an elderly lady, a carer, who was looking after her husband full-time. They sent her to jail because on Facebook, she made an offensive comment about a local mosque, and it was very offensive, and I found it absolutely disgusting. And she wrote it on Facebook, and they sent her to jail for 2 years. And to get these people to go to jail, they had to release 5,000 prisoners on early release after serving only 40% of their sentences, while also having 10,500 foreign national criminals in our prisons, who we should deport out of the UK. So this is where we are, which is a crazy situation. We're putting people into prison for what they write on Facebook and Twitter. And yes, it's very offensive. I don't like their opinions, but I don't think they should be going to jail for what they write on Facebook in the privacy of their own home. If they are idiotic enough to say something like that, then hopefully people will see through them. And we don't have enough places in our prisons for these people, partly because we've got 10,300 people from outside of the UK in our prisons who we can't deport. So there you are.
Quite mind-boggling, to say the least. I think we are closing towards the end. I would like to ask from both of you regarding this title or the description of this what I would call radical progressivism and left-wing authoritarianism, they still call themselves liberal and democratic in their view. But as both of you have described quite well, that the political establishment is both unwilling and incompetent to make any kind of policy change because of these election results and so on, they then go for the path of free speech, clampdown, and so on. So perhaps a little bit negative feeling to end on, note to end on, but is, in your opinion, polarization inevitable under these circumstances? And how long do you think that these people can call themselves liberal without it being completely ridiculous?
Let me keep my answer brief because I'm conscious I've been speaking a lot. If there's one book that's influenced my thinking on this more than any other, it's by Eric Kaufman and his book Taboo, How Making Race Sacred Created a Cultural Revolution. It's just come out a month ago. It's very good. It's called Taboo, or The Third Awakening, published in America. And Eric makes the argument that what we are living through is a cultural revolution, but it is one defined by viewing racial, sexual, and gender minorities as sacred. It is the sacralization of minorities that defines cultural socialism or wokeism. And the reason that's so important is because if you perceive that your sacred values are violated, you will then compromise on many other things that define our democratic society. So in order to preserve the emotional safety of minorities, you will compromise on free speech. You will compromise on free expression. You will say, actually, it's okay, like Herbert Marcuse and others, that we deprive conservatives of free speech, or we shut down X, or we take on Elon Musk, because in the name of our sacred values of preserving the new religion, as John McWhorter would call it, which is, I think, what it is, as Andrew Doyle has written, this is a new religion for the elite class. You will basically happily sacrifice free speech on the altar of this new religion. Now, I've seen this in the universities time and time again. So no, they're not liberal, they are illiberal. Frank Fukuyama has made this argument too in his book, Liberalism and Its Discontent. He says, look, if you think this is liberal, if you think what is happening at the moment is liberalism, look again. This is an ideology that subordinates individual rights behind fixed group identities. This is an ideology that has no interest in scientific knowledge or evidence when it is seen to conflict with the claims of this ideology, as I mentioned, with gender ideology especially. And this is an ideology that has no interest in bringing people together around a shared sense of identity, community, and humanity. It is simply about pushing people apart based on their fixed group identities. That is why it is fundamentally an illiberal project that really should not have any place at all in our public institutions. But it is kept there by people who think they're liberal and who, as you rightly pointed out in your remarks, are now inflating social norms like far right, hard right, hate's the new one, to shut down discussion and debate that they don't like. And as they inflate these social norms, they stigmatize people who are merely trying to express a different view. A micro example of this is Wikipedia. Wikipedia has been captured. It's been captured by leftists. I mean, I play a game with myself. Every morning I wake up and I look at what edits have they made to my Wikipedia biography, because there's always one. And it's very subtle, but the name of the game is to discredit any perceived opposition to the project. That's the name of the game, to inflate social norms and to control the national conversation by changing the way that we use these social norms. The question is, are people going to see through it? And my gut instinct is I actually think they're starting to. The reason that Donald Trump is still competitive in the US. The reason Nigel Farage is still mainstream frontline politician, who, by the way, owes a lot of his success, your third example, owes a lot of his success to Finland, because it was a Finnish politician who taught Nigel Farage how to be a populist. And I don't need to tell you which one it was, but I think I'm speaking alongside him at the Reform Conference next week. But that's why I think maybe these social norms are breaking down, because voters can now see, and this is why my personal view is, I think Elon Musk, whatever your politics, I think he's incredibly important, because he is allowing voters to see what is really happening. And in the UK, the riots were a great example of that. Had we not had X, we would only have had the official narrative as to what was going on. But because we could go on X and we could look at what was happening, we could see the violence was coming from all sides, not just white British, it was coming from all sides, different communities. We would never have seen that. And I think, throwing light on social problems, throwing light on what is really happening is really critically important.
And then Markku.
Yes, maybe I present a couple of comments especially from the Finnish perspective. I still remember 1989, 1991, which was the phase when the communism collapsed in Eastern Europe. We no longer had these people's democracies in East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania. Then Soviet Union ceased to exist in December 1991, and this was a formative experience for me personally in my life. And back in 1991, beginning of 1992, I was very optimistic about the future, and I was thinking that, okay, now finally we get rid of this, that we are grouping people in different groups and talking about them as collectives, and now we start to approach the reality where everybody can be treated as an individual. And this is one of the most surprising things that I have had to witness in the past 10 or 15 years, that this group thinking has become back now in ethnic terms, and especially those people who call themselves liberals. They are reducing the human existence to the fact that you are part of some ethnic group, and that then defines you 100%. And I think it's absolutely absurd, and we should be heading towards completely the other direction. So those hopes that I had in the beginning of 1990s, they weren't realized, unfortunately. And some other surprises on the long way as well. We in Finland, we have historical experience of this. We had in 1970s a movement called Taistoist movement, which was this far left communist fraction of the Finnish Communist Party, very Marxist and orthodox Marxist group. And funny thing in Finland was that the academic youth were one of the most eager followers of this movement, and they were outright fans of Soviet Union and Soviet system, and they were supposed to be the brightest young minds in the whole country, but somehow they became so blind that they didn't see what kind of country Soviet Union was. This went on for some 10 years, a little bit less than 10 years, but then it passed and we got rid of that. And I'm hoping, I try to be optimistic about the future and think that, okay, even these crazy phenomena that we have now in today's realities, they will pass, and then 20 years from now on we will laugh and think about the 2024, that what all kinds of stupid ideas we had back then. But then we have social media, and then we have this phenomenon that people tend to now be part of their own groups of people who tend to think the same way that they do themselves, and now it's completely possible to isolate yourself from those people who think differently. And from this point of view, for example, the homogeneity of university students in political in terms of political thinking, that's a worrying trend, because then we lose the richness of humankind in this. But I still remember 1980s when I was 15 years old, and there was in Finland, there was this humor magazine called Pahkasika. I was a very eager fan of that. And then we also had this band called Sleepy Sleepers, which was doing this absolutely horrible rock music, and they were criticizing Soviet Union, and they were criticizing President Kekkonen. And back in the day, it was bold to be an open fan of Sleepers because they were anti-establishment for sure. And I grew up thinking that, okay, I'm a liberal because I read Pahkasik and I listen to Sleepers. And I would not have in my life believed that come 2020s, I will be accused by my academic colleagues of being a conservative, which I still don't think. I don't see myself as a conservative, but that's where I am at the moment. Let's wait for 10 years or 20 years and see where I am back then.
Thank you, Markku. You almost corrected my pessimistic note, but then you left it somewhere in a gray area. But thank you, both of you, gentlemen. Let's give a big round of applause for both of them. Ja nyt jos on yleisöllä kysymyksiä, nousee useampi käsi. Several questions from the audience, so there is an assistant there who can give the mic. If you can give it first to Mr. Junnila there.
Distinguished Chairman, dear friends, I'm one of those 46 MPs that were mentioned, coming from southwest part of Finland, actually same area where Mr. Joki Sipilä is currently residing in. And welcome to Helsinki, Mr. Goodwin. Sometimes if I go to the eastern part of Helsinki, it reminds me of Leicester or Birmingham. The center area is a lot like Cambridge or Bristol these days, so you get the point. I'll spare Mr. Joki Sipilä this time because I have asked him so many questions before, but I have two for you, Mr. Goodwin. The first one is a bit light-hearted. I remember back in 2017, you predicted Labour would get no more than 38% of vote. And if they did, you would eat the book. And they received 40%. So I remember in Sky News, you chewed one page of your book. My question is, which page was it and what did it include? What did it contain? That's the first question. And the second one is about Tory and the political situation in UK. Some of my friends, for example, like Mr. Whittingdale or Mr. Pritchard, are in very safe seats. They are from the Conservative Party. So they got elected, but a lot of others did not. But the funny thing is, because of the rising of the Reform UK Party, in some areas, actually the amount of votes received by Tory candidates was somewhat less, but the Labour candidate did not receive any more votes than before. But the Reform UK candidate ate up a couple of thousand from the Tory candidate, and then we ended up having a Labour candidate being elected just because of that. And my question is, because of the situation where Tory, the Conservative Party, is these days, do you envision we are in the future we would go through a longer Labour tenure at the government? Because obviously unless they could somehow join forces and, as you said, Tory needs to really update their political program to what it was before and actually do the things. But would we end in a situation where we could have maybe 2 or 3 terms consecutive of Labour in power in UK just because of the Reform UK being alive? Thank you.
The first question, I can't remember what specific page I ate, but I did receive some criticism for not eating the whole book. I'm not sure what people were expecting me to do on television, but yeah, it was a bet that went wrong. I haven't made a bet since. On your latter question, look, the answer depends on your personal politics. There are some people who say it is a question of national importance and an urgent task that the Conservatives and the Reform Party unify as quickly as possible to defeat a very radical Labour government at the next election. And their argument would be the stakes are so high, large-scale migration, crack down on free speech, an overloaded state, a broken economy, the advance of woke ideology, all of these things necessitate a conservative merger with the Reform Party. There are others, however, and I lean more in this camp, who would say that actually what is needed in British politics in some form or other is a complete reinvention of what small c conservatism really is. And what I think we're going to need is a prolonged political debate, if not battle, to decide what vision of conservatism do we really want? Do we want liberal conservatism that is indistinguishable from the Labour Party, which has given us many of the things that have undermined our country and economy over the last 20, 30 years? Or do we want a genuinely national conservatism that wants to end the current policy of mass immigration, wants to embed a principle of national preference into the economy, the housing market, welfare, and which is skeptical, if not openly hostile, towards hyper-globalization and free markets and what they've done to the working class. And this is not advocating protectionism, it's not advocating redistribution, it is saying simply that everything we can see now in the UK is a result of very specific political choices that were taken by an earlier generation of both Labour and Conservative politicians, and that what I think we probably need, well, what I do think we need, is a radical break from that status quo. I don't think the Reform Party is a perfect vessel. I don't think Nigel Farage is a perfect politician for that job. But I do think that there are vehicles in British politics that can be used to catalyse and bring about that debate about what does a more credible, compelling conservatism look like in British politics. And that is what we need to see, because I really genuinely think that the Conservative Party is philosophically lost. It's electorally broken. It's ideologically confused. Doesn't know what it is anymore. Doesn't know who it wants to vote for it anymore. Doesn't understand why people have just rejected it en masse. The current Conservative leadership contest is very bland. There are no new ideas. It seems to now just be focused on very vacuous words. Kemi Badenoch says renewal. Tom Tugendhat says revitalise. It's a lot of stuff that means nothing. And Farage, if the Conservatives go left in this leadership election, if they vote for a Liberal, I don't think Farage will ever have had as much space in British politics as he will have over the next 5 years. And I really think he will probably have a chance at realigning the Conservative movement. So watch the space.
I think we have time for two questions, but there in the front row. Go ahead.
This is for both of you. 2 questions briefly. Joki Sipilä, let's say bloc politics are here to stay, because you mentioned that these sides are highly divided and attack each other, very polarized. And then what Mr. Goodwin said, do you think we need to invent national identity and cultural, national culture anew? Do we need an idea what it is about to be British or Finnish? Do we need some kind of new ideas and deeper issues to build our identity on a more natural ground to oppose that woke and political identities?
Yes, thank you. At least we have strong tendency towards bloc politics in Finland. If you think about the most recent elections, when we had the parliamentary elections in 2023, then the red-green electorate they voted for Social Democrats because Sanna Marin told them to do so, and they followed suit. Then when we had the presidential election, then they voted for Pekka Haavisto, the Green candidate. And now in the European elections, they voted for the chairman of the Left Alliance, Li Andersson, who had this astonishing election result, 250 votes. I think that it all boils down to what the Social Democratic Party on the one hand will do in the future, and then what the Centre Party will do on the other hand. And although Centre Party, they have had very sad times now for 10 years or so. After 2015, that was their last good election. Then it has been a downward spiral after that. Now they are down to 23 candidates, which is a historically low number for them. But then if they would decide to be an openly bourgeois party and be in the common front with the National Coalition Kokoomus Party, the Finns Party, and Christian Democrats and the Swedish Party, then the situation would be that they could be able to hold the Social Democrats out of the Finnish government for 10 years or 20 years if they would decide to do so. I don't know what they are going to do. They are in a state of confusion because of the bad election results that they have been having. The other way out of the bloc political route is that the Social Democrats will move towards the right or towards the center first, and maybe be a similar kind of party that they were in 1990s when Paavo Lipponen was the chairman of the party. But so far, they have the new party leader, Antti Lindman. I have seen absolutely no signs of this happening. They are still as much on the left as they were during Sanna Marin's leadership. So it remains to be seen. And one thing I dare to predict that come the next parliamentary elections in 2027, the forming of the government after that will be an extremely difficult task.
The question about national identity, I think, is critical because what is happening in the UK and elsewhere is that essentially national identity is being, as it always has been, but it is being reinvented again by a large part of the elite class. Now, in the UK, British identity, English identity is being repackaged around universal liberal themes of diversity and multiculturalism. So you see this after every major sporting event, the elite class says, isn't it wonderful that what defines us now is that we celebrate our diversity? And that is a very thin, civic, instrumental sense of who we are, which the elite class promote, because we also know they put much less emphasis on their ascribed identities, on their group belonging. They're much more about their achieved identities, their educational achievements, their liberal values. Now, the problem with that reinvention, which is why populism is still doing so well across the West, is because many voters feel that repackaging their national identity around universal themes that could just as easily apply to any other country around the world is undermining their sense of who they are. And as I said earlier on, saying that a country welcomes and celebrates diversity is fine, but it cannot be the basis of your entire national identity, because it is the same thing as saying you have no identity of your own. That if the only thing that is unique about you is that you welcome others, well, what is it that actually defines you? And many voters across the West feel that they do have a distinctive national identity, culture, language, ancestry, history, way of life that is distinctive and is something they want to preserve and promote, which is what this association right here is all about for you guys in Finland, right? And what makes me nervous about the elite class today, among many other things, is that they seem increasingly incapable of accepting that that is an entirely legitimate position to hold. That if you want to celebrate something distinctive about being British or English, the fact that maybe your ancestors had contributed into the national pot over generations. The fact that you have a proud history. The fact that I would argue England is the home of individual liberty and parliamentary democracy, and we can go on. And it's one of the only places to have successfully avoided invasion for 1,000 years, and so on and so on and so on and so on. To turn all of that into a very bland, vacuous, meaningless celebration of diversity does a disservice to who you are and your national community. And that, I think, is where many people are becoming very angry. For example, we've now got, under the new Labour government, a new curriculum for our school children. So they will now be taught essentially more about what is wrong with British history, with our empire, with our association with slavery, than either what Britain got right or how those things are also practiced by many non-Western states even today. So we have a very biased education system, essentially, which again is undermining the sense of who we are. And my last point, another book I'm reading at the moment by Frank Furedi, and I wrote a Substack on this last week, called The War Against Our Past. And Frank argues basically that what we are living through is a redirection of the culture wars from the present to the past. And he traces the ideological influences, decolonization and critical race theory and postmodernism, and he goes through the whole intellectual history of it. But he says, essentially what is underway now is a concerted attempt to deconstruct the anchors that underpin Western societies. And once those anchors come loose, you are going to have a lot of people who really have no sense of meaning in their life, because the only sense of meaning they're getting now is from very short-term, ephemeral, meaningless things, which is why I think narcissism is making a big comeback. But I think there's a really, there is an attack underway, a culture of repudiation that is underway now in many Western societies, either by incompetence or by ideological direction.
Great answer, I must say. Thank you for that. As the gentleman there took both of those last two questions, let's give a final applause to the two gentlemen here.